Okay, let's get underway. This is session 2. The series we're in, if I turn on everything, the series that we're in is looking at understanding our faith a little bit better. It's just some sample, like we're doing drill samples. We're just tapping into half a dozen selected things. It actually started out many years ago when I wrote a program. The program I was developing at St Francis College was called the Archbishop's Certificate Program. It did get picked up in Grafton. It was called the Bishop's Certificate Program. So I wrote most of those units way back then. But it quickly became apparent that actually we needed some sort of primer first, because a lot of the people doing the course had some really basic questions. I then wrote a little 6-week program called Anglican Basics, and that got used by hundreds of people around Brisbane and Grafton and Rockhampton and various places. So I went back to that, but I've changed it around a little bit, but more or less I'm working through the same topics that we looked at in that program all those years ago. So, it fits, of course, beautifully well with the service this morning, in that, particularly today, but the overall program is taking Jesus seriously, trying to work out what difference does that make to me and to us in our life together. So we're doing over 6 weeks. Last week we did a thing on being Anglican as one way of being Christian. Today we're doing disciples of Jesus. Next week we'll focus on, very briefly, one session on the Bible. Then we're having a session on spiritual practice, which of course includes prayer and meditation. I'm hoping that Rogers will lead that session for us. There may well be some gaps here in the dates, because I'm going to Canada for 2 weeks for my daughter's wedding. So these are not 6 consecutive weeks. It's like 3 weeks in a row, then a couple of gaps. So I'll have to check the dates for you, or it's in the bulletin. The 5 marks of mission, which come from the Anglican Communion, sort of up there. And then intentional discipleship, and trying to rethink what it means to be Christian these days. So today we're focusing on Jesus, and he didn't look like that at all, of course. But that's kind of how he looks in church. It just depends how much money you have as to how fancy the iconography and the mosaic and so on is. So this is obviously from the inside dome of a Greek Orthodox church. Jesus is looking very imperial. He's the emperor of the universe, very sort of Byzantine style. Of course, he's holding wrong button. What am I doing here? He's holding a book, and in true Greek Orthodox icon style, these 2 letters here and over here, they're the first and last letters of 2 words, Jesus Christ, in Greek. So that's where so these representations, of course, are dripping with symbolism, and this way of thinking about Jesus emerged after the empire and the church merged. So Jesus had to look like an emperor, but he had to fit into the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire got some reflected glory and social cohesion by being kind of blessed and approved of by the church. Now that's 300 years and a very long way from Jesus being crucified by the Roman government. A lot happened in those 300 years in terms of changing dynamics. So we're going to think a little bit about what it means to be disciples of Jesus, or people of the way, and I'll come back to that phrase, the way, a bit later on. This image has been around for a long time. And it picks up a really important point, and it's a humorous cartoon. Obviously, it's meant to be a sort of quiz show, and we've got 3 contestants, each of them claiming to be Jesus. So you've got the sort of Protestant Jesus, who's very clean. His hair has obviously been washed and properly groomed, and his beard is trimmed, and he basically looks white. He probably looks a little bit. And he's glowing. He does have a faint remnant of the halo, because he's a holy person. Okay, the Protestant Jesus. He's doing pretty well on the quiz, by the way. He's got 3 out of 4 answers right. So I'm not sure what the cartoonist is trying to tell us. The other end, you've got the Catholic Jesus, and he's a very sad Jesus. It's the bleeding heart, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the suffering Jesus, who's dealing with the guilt of the world, which the Catholic Church has not only placed on every individual, but has particularly placed on his soldiers. And he's got a big halo, but he looks pretty, and he's basically naked, and he's wearing his crown of thorns, he's got blood dripping down his face, and he's locked in the moment of a horrible death, as if there's nothing more to say about Jesus. Okay? That's the critical moment. And then we have the sort of guy who you wouldn't want sitting next to you on the airplane. Well, you wouldn't be too keen on the third one either. But the historical Jesus, and he's not doing it all well. He's not getting any of the answers right. Okay? He's going to be excluded from the competition shortly, from the game. And he's a man of Middle Eastern appearance. He's not well groomed, and he looks like a foreigner, because he is in many ways. So these are not sort of canonical images, but it's just a way of reminding us that different forms of Christian spirituality actually have a very different picture of Jesus in their head. Okay? And for them, that's how it is. So a Catholic and a Protestant just cannot understand the way the other person talks about Jesus. And they both get really upset when people like me start talking about, but what about what about the actual guy? Shouldn't we pay a bit of attention to him? Oh, no, don't need to do that. The church has told us what to believe. Well, which church? Because as we've seen in the Greek Orthodox Church, he looks like an emperor. In the Protestant Church, he looks like a bit of a sleazy salesman. The Catholic Church, he's beaten up. He's a victim, the eternal victim. And the academic Jesus, the historical Jesus, is not somebody you want sitting in the pew next to you at the cathedral. We decided to come back and see Roger on Monday and get a food voucher. Okay? So this goes to the question then, where do we begin? Do we begin at the top and work down? In other words, the church tells us what to think about Jesus in the creeds, in the liturgies and so on, and then we just transfer that down and try to make sense of it at the ground level? Or do we start with the human Jesus, who actually lived and did stuff in Galilee, and then see how our understanding of him changed? So do we start with the divine Jesus and work down to the human, or do we start with the human Jesus and follow the process as he becomes much more than that in the imagination of his followers? And a lot of contemporary theological scholarship, particularly New Testament and Jesus scholarship, is really on two totally different tracks, because they start the journey at different places. They really are heading in different directions. I'm somebody who likes to begin from below. In other words, rather than starting with a lot of finely nuanced philosophical statements, which are actually anchored in 4th century Greek philosophical terminology, which doesn't work in the modern world, actually. None of us follow Aristotle or Plato and so on the way they did in the 4th and 5th century. Do we start with those and then try to make sense of Jesus as one of us? Or do we start with Jesus as one of us and then say, well, how do we talk about him in God language if he's actually, the first thing about Jesus is that he's a real human being? And that's a historical rock we can work with. It's so you see the two different methods. So I'm going to be beginning from below. So we're talking about a person we call Jesus, but his mum probably called him Yeshua when he was late for dinner. Okay? Yeshua. Now, if she was speaking Hebrew, she would have called him Yehoshua, which is Joshua. So he had a very good Bible name. Okay? Joshua, Yehoshua in Hebrew, Yeshua in Aramaic, Yesu in Greek, and then eventually comes out as Jesus, or Jose in Spanish. I mean, these are all the same word. So a man called Jesus, which, by the way, was a very common name for Jewish boys in the first century. Okay? The name, he wasn't like if he had gone to school, he wouldn't have been the only kid in class with that name. Would have been lots of them, like John or Peter or whatever. He was a Jewish person. And not only that, he was a Jewish male. So that has all sorts of implications in terms of the obligations on him as a Jewish man in terms of the Jewish religion. He lived in the first century, of what we call the first century, because at the present point in human history, people like us get to decide the calendar. Maybe in another 100 years or so, the Chinese calendar will be the international calendar. At the moment, it's the Western Christian calendar. And what we call the first century wasn't the first century for the people living in it. That's only our way. Because we divide time before Jesus and after Jesus. Okay? People weren't doing that. Like, oh, Jesus, thank goodness you're here. We can put our clocks forward or put our clocks back to year one. None of those conversations happened in the first century. So he was a long way away. I'm going to unpack each of these points, well, most of these points briefly. And he came from the village of Nazareth in the Galilee. Okay? So this is, if you're starting with from below, if you're starting with the human Jesus on earth in the time of the Roman Empire, this is the basic set of data we're working with. So let's unpack each of those a little bit. We obviously have no photographs of Jesus. We don't even have any drawings of Jesus. But this one is a drawing of a person from Egypt done on a piece of timber, and it's from about 150 AD. So but he was wealthy enough as well to have somebody paint his picture. He's pretty scrubbed up. My mother would have said he needs a haircut, but he's compared with some of the other images we just saw, he's pretty cool. So that's what a person from the eastern end of the Mediterranean probably looked like even 100 years earlier. Okay, remember, the only people who got their images preserved were rich and powerful. It basically had to be an emperor. And then you had statues carved, always flattering, and you had your image banged onto coins. Okay? So we really don't know what ancient people look like. It's not so easy to tell, but this happens to be a very beautiful piece of work which was recovered in the last 100 years or so. This is probably how your Sunday school told you Jesus looked. Okay, your grandmother or your mother or even you yourself might have had one of these hanging somewhere around the house. This is the Protestant Jesus. Okay, and he certainly didn't look like that. Okay, even to have a white-coloured robe that stayed that clean would be quite a remarkable feat, of course. And his hair is just so clean. Face is so shiny. It's probably looked more like that. This is a reconstruction done a few years ago now, 10 or so years ago, a BBC program called Son of God. And in one part of the program, 1 week in the 4-week program, they got in some anthropologists, some physical anthropologists, and they had a set of skulls from the ancient. They had European skulls, and they had a number of skulls from the Middle East, and they looked at differences in the shape of a Middle Eastern person's head and a European person's head. And these were sort of forensic anthropologists whose job was to create images of people the police were looking for. So they were well skilled at coming up with generic kind of images which would give a sense of a person. So this was the attempt to show somebody who's of sort of Lebanese, Middle Eastern, Palestinian kind of background, spent most of his life outdoors, has never seen a tube of cream, oil of Ulan or whatever. It's a totally unknown phenomenon. Hair would have been hacked with a sharp blade rather than cut by a skilled barber and so on. And this is exactly the kind of person, if they walked up at the airport with a ticket to travel to Istanbul, would be taken aside by the security and interviewed for quite a period of time. Okay? So that's not the face of Jesus, but that's the typical, atypical first century Jewish Middle Eastern appearance, in the opinion of, based on the shape of the skull and the social and cultural dynamics and so on of the time. The eyes are a bit unfortunate in that region, sort of looks a bit haunted. Okay, so let's unpack briefly the Jewishness of Jesus. He wasn't a Christian. He never went to church. Guess what? He wasn't even an Anglican. Okay? Or a Methodist, or a Roman Catholic. Okay? He was Jewish. And that's a basic fact that we all know up here, but we sort of adopt him into our world. And he belongs in another world. In other words, he was shaped by the traditions and by the experiences of Jewish people more than 2,000 years ago. And those included having lost their independence, and they were simply a small community with some distinctive practices and beliefs who were always part of somebody else's empire. And they, in many cases, they'd managed to carve out a niche for themselves as traders, and so the Jewish diaspora, as it was called, was spread all around the Roman world and all through the Middle East. There were small Jewish communities everywhere. Interesting, I didn't have time to read the article, but I saw a headline today in Haaretz, which is a Jewish newspaper from Jerusalem, saying that the people in Iraq are saying they want to have their Jewish neighbourhoods back. They'd like the Jews who left in 1948 to go to Israel, they'd like them to come back because Baghdad is missing something without the Jewish quarter. It's not going to happen just at the moment, but that's that reflects that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Jewish people lived all through the Middle East, and until 1948 they spoke Arabic and they ate Arab food, and they had their few rules about cooking it, but their music was Arab and their language was Arabic, and their food was smelt like Arabic food and so on. And what happened in 1948 kind of smashed the vase, and who knows how long before we can put it back together. So Jesus was shaped by those traditions and experiences of being Jewish, which included particularly the idea of the covenant, that God had a covenant with the Jewish people, and that there was a prophetic edge to the covenant tradition. And the prophetic edge included doing justice for people, particularly the widows and the orphans. And the prophets were people who spoke, they weren't fortune tellers, the prophets were people who criticised the ruler, and of course often came to a sticky end as a result. And of course critical, absolutely central to the ancient Jewish self-concept was the importance of Jerusalem, the temple, the place where God was going to be found. So that's a kind of these will be the kinds of things we would assume were true about Jesus simply because we know he was Jewish. Okay, he would have been circumcised. He would have expected that the first thing he had to do when he grew up was get married and have kids, because that's the first commandment for a Jewish man, is to marry and have children. Okay? He would have grown up in a culture where you look after your parents, and if your father has died, you look after your mother. You stay at home and look after her. You don't go wandering off doing other stuff. Okay? So you can see already there's some issues that are going to emerge around that. He was a first century person. He didn't live in the 20th century or the 21st century. He'd never seen an aeroplane. He never he never had an iPhone, any of those things. He's a person of the distant past, and the distance is not just 2,000 years. Culturally, socially, economically, all kinds of ways, Jesus is from a faraway place. Okay, it's not just 2,000 years. Up until about 200 years ago, you could probably argue, maybe slightly more, up until say 300, 400 years ago, around about 1700, you could probably argue that most people were still living a kind of village life, agrarian villages, very low level technology and so on. So life hadn't changed much through the medieval period down into early modernity. But with industrialisation and the invention of mechanisation and so on, printing press and other forms of mechanisation, our world changed. And so the world that Jesus lived in, which had been fairly stable, that was one of its features, socially, culturally very stable, began a period of rapid change, and the speed of change, of course, is increasing exponentially. So his culture was very different. His technology, their best invention was iron. Okay, they were in the Iron Age, and we stayed in the Iron Age until very, very recently. In terms of sociology, the family was the most important thing, as it still is for Arabs in the Middle East. You meet someone in the Middle East, they want to know where you're from and who your grandfather was, because probably they knew him. But they can put you into they know where you fit in if they know your grandparents. Okay? Their religion, of course, was very, very different. Jesus was part of a religion where animal sacrifice happened every single day, and we're talking truckloads of animals being sacrificed every day. Think of the smell in Jerusalem. It's basically the temple is an outdoor abattoir, and there is no refrigeration, and there are no high-pressure hoses. Okay, that's why you have incense. It's room freshener for holy places. Okay, so Jerusalem would have smelt like a non-stop barbecue site. Okay, that's totally foreign to us. There's one Christian church I know of, a place called Taibe, a little Greek, actually the Church of St. George at Taibe, and it's the ruins of the old church. But they still sacrifice goats there once a year on the Feast of St. George. And in the corner of the church, there's a chain hanging down and there's a pool of blood on the floor. Well, extrapolate that 1,000 times, you get some idea of what the temple would have been like. Okay? So just that one thing alone is a huge difference. We're a religion of the book. A religion of animal sacrifice is a totally different ballgame. His understanding of science, of course, was very, very different. And frankly, he probably wouldn't have had much education, and therefore wouldn't have even been aware of what science existed in places like Alexandria. He was most likely illiterate, as most people were in our world, until there was an economic advantage to the owners of the factories, post-industrialisation. It was economically useful to have workers who were literate. So we started mass education. Until then, you only got educated if there was a good reason, and still the case. You only got educated if there was a good reason. Economics, in the case of the people who ran the cotton mills and the factories. In the ancient world, you'd be literate if you were born into a priest family, because the priests had to count things. And they had to keep lists of calendars and when the holy days were due and all the rest, maintain the genealogies. If you were in the ruling class, perhaps if you were a merchant, and certainly if you were a priest, you would understand reading and writing. Okay, but the vast majority of people were illiterate. And certainly in a little tiny pioneer farming village like Nazareth, there was no reason and no capacity to offer even a primary school education for the kids in the village. And even then it would have been the boys, not the girls, because there was no sense wasting education on girls. Okay? That, of course, has only changed in my lifetime. Even when I was a teenager growing up, I was going to go to university. The first kid in my family to go to university, the girls weren't. They're going to get married and have kids. Yeah? How things have changed in the course of 50 or so years. And the other thing about Jesus is that his public activity was incredibly short, maybe not much longer than 12 months. So maybe he did stay at home and look after mum most of his time. But that's not the bit of Jesus we see. The only bit of Jesus' life that we see is the 12 to 18 months when he was out on the program causing trouble from the perspective of the rulers. The rest of his life is, of course, invisible to us. So the Jewish Jesus, the first century Jesus, and now the Jesus of Nazareth, obscure village. We've talked about Nazareth other times. Tiny little village. No one had ever heard of it. It's not mentioned in the Old Testament, ever, not once. Probably because it didn't exist. It had no biblical pedigree. Compare the difference of saying, I was born in Bethlehem to I was born in Nazareth. Where? Where's that? Everybody knew where Bethlehem was. David's city, special place. Nazareth? Gotta be kidding. So, what's special about you? Can't be your birthplace, okay? So Nazareth is a kind of bougainville. Probably a pioneer Jewish farming settlement that maybe was in its second generation by the time of Jesus. One of the reasons for saying that I'll come to in a second, but very, very small place, maybe only 15 families. But remember, each of those families would have had 10 or 12 kids. Because they didn't have the pill, but they still like sex. So, happens. Lots of babies. And the child mortality rate would have been third world by our standards, child mortality rate. The reason I say Jesus' family may not have been there in the very first generation is they didn't even own any land. The fact that Joseph is a smith, we call him a carpenter, but that's because Ulysses was a carpenter and nothing to do with Jesus. Just the way people told stories in the ancient world. Joseph is represented as the village handyman. If your plough breaks, if you want something fixed, you take it to him. Okay. Now, the only people who make a living in a little farming village by doing those sort of jobs are people who don't own their own block of land. And they're having to eke out an existence by fixing other people's equipment, doing a few odd jobs around the village. Okay, so Jesus not only growing up in a small village on the northern edge of civilization from Jerusalem's point of view, but his parents were so poor that they probably didn't even own a piece of dirt because Joseph was a blacksmith, more so than a carpenter. Okay? Growing up as the son of a carpenter, I always liked the idea that Jesus was the carpenter's son. But the word tecton is actually the word we get technology from. The Greek word technon and so on. So it's somebody who works with timber, stone and metal. Okay? Technician, same word. So it's not that Joseph ran the phone exchange, but he was the technician. He was the guy you went to if something broke. And the family and the village was deeply attached to Jerusalem and its temple, and we know that because of the things we've found in the dirt in some of the first century houses that we've excavated in Nazareth. So although it was a long way, about 100 k's from Jerusalem, which was about 4 days walking on a pretty bumpy road, the people in in Nazareth knew they were Jewish, and the temple was the most important place on earth for them. So that's part of Jesus' upbringing. So he's a Jewish person from the first century, from a little village no one had ever heard of called Nazareth. And then we come to the one thing about him which is absolutely hardcore historical reality. He was crucified by the Roman authorities in Palestine. Again, crucifixion in the first century did not look like a crucifix in a church. Okay? People that have designed crosses, and the cross did not become the symbol for Christianity until after the merger with the Roman Empire, which is interesting. For that, they use things like fish. Okay? The Eucharist, sharing, poor people sharing what they have together. After the emperor becomes Christian, the cross, the hangman's noose, becomes the symbol of this religion. The point of crucifixion is that you were stuck on a pole out in the open air, usually next to a road, and you were left there till you died. And indeed, you were left there after you died as a public service announcement. You step out of line, this is what we will do to you. Okay? The other thing was, you did not get buried. The point of crucifying you was to strip you of every form of dignity which mattered to you and, more importantly, to your carers. This is state terrorism. So if we don't even hand the body over for a burial, that's going to really hurt. That's really going to upset people. Okay? So, you certainly were not crucified by having your hands nailed to a horizontal piece of timber. Okay, that's not how. There are articles online you can read if you want to go into the gruesome details. But basically, you died of asphyxiation. Eventually, you got so tired you could not hold your chest up to take a lungful of air, so you choked. I bet it could take several days before you became that weak. Okay, horrible, horrible death. I'm not sure, I couldn't get a bigger version of this image, but this actually shows really well. Quite often, the stumps of olive trees would be a crucifixion site, because all you've got to do is nail the crosspiece, and you provide them with a little seat, little ledge that they can sit on. And when you're ready to be a little bit merciful to them, you take that little ledge away, and by then they're so weak they can't hold themselves up, and so they choke. Okay.
And what happens then? What happens? I mean, are they just left where they are, or?
As long they'll be left there. I mean, again, depends on who's connected with you, but basically you will eventually be taken down because the smell and so on is going to be awful. But in the meantime, the birds and the foxes or whatever are going to have their way with you.
Oh, dear.
The bodies are normally thrown into a common grave and are covered with limestone. Limestone, fertilizer basically. Limestone? It's not quite the word. Lime, no stone, because it helps the body to decompose. Okay. Now we know that there were literally thousands of people, Jewish people, crucified by the Romans in the first century, particularly around the time of the siege of Jerusalem, 68, 69, 70 AD. There were thousands of them being crucified, hundreds every day, so much so that they were running out of timber to use for the cross pieces and so on. Okay? We've found one skeleton of a crucified person. And he was from a wealthy family, and after he died, his family got permission to take him down from the cross, and he was buried with the nail through his foot still attached to a piece of wood from the cross. That's how we know he was a crucifixion victim. His name was Johannan. So we actually know his name. Okay. So crucifixion was incredibly common, but it was about the empire showing who's boss. There are many ways to kill people. This was torture that ends with death. So crucifixion is the most certain historical fact about Jesus, because you would never make it up. Okay? If you're trying to start a new religion in the Roman Empire, you're not going to start out by saying, let me talk to you about Jesus who was crucified when Pontius Pilate, that's going to go nowhere. So this is hardcore, absolutely non-negotiable historical fact. Crucifixion was reserved for the enemies of the empire, not just people with speeding tickets. Okay?
Speeding tickets.
Well, you get a really fast chariot on the road to Caesarea. And if you were a Roman citizen, you could not be crucified, even if you'd fallen out with the powers that be. So Paul, as a Roman citizen, was going to be killed by the Romans, but he wasn't going to be crucified. He had to get off the cross-free card because he was a Roman citizen. Okay? So again, that's a different. That tells us Jesus was a person of low status in the Roman Empire. He didn't have Roman citizenship. Whatever he did to upset the Romans through Pontius Pilate, blah, 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 okay, it tells us something about where he fitted into the scheme of things. Yeah.
Just a question, Greg. Is there any significance of the time that Jesus was born?
The time that he was born.
Yeah.
Well, one problem is we have no idea when Jesus was born. We don't know the year nor the month.
But he was born within the context of the Roman Empire.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, okay.
So
We can be reasonably sure he was born within a 50-year window of the 2nd of April in the year 30 AD.
He was born
Yeah.
about then.
Well, he was probably not older than 50 because kids from Nazareth would rarely live as old as 30, let alone 50. So let's say that the maximum he could have lived would have been, given that he did eventually end up being crucified, he was probably somewhere in his 30s or 40s when he was crucified. But we don't know even that. But yeah, so he's born in the time, what's called the sort of Herodian period. So he may have been born in the dying years or the final years of Herod the Great's rule, which was a reign of terror. And he lived through the political chaos of the succession struggles between the three boys, Philip, Antipas, and Archelaus, which eventually led to Roman intervention, with Archelaus being given the shove and Roman procurators being put in charge. And that's why there was a Roman governor in Jerusalem when there wouldn't normally have been one. So if things had worked out differently with the Herodian succession, nobody would have been crucified in Jerusalem in the first few decades of the first century. They would have been stoned to death, had their heads chopped off, various other things done to them, but Jewish people didn't use crucifixion. So the fact that he was crucified says the Romans did it. He was not killed by the Jews. Despite 2,000 years of Christians saying the Jews killed Jesus, well, that's because we're sucking up to the empire. We say, let's blame the Jews. You don't like the Jews. We don't like the Jews. Let's blame the Jews. Okay? Because we like the empire. Empire likes us. Yeah. So yes, had certain historical dynamics just worked a bit differently, Jesus would not have been crucified.
Well, I was thinking of, it was the Roman Empire that he was born into. Is that just when it's a possibility, or were there other events in history that Jesus could have come in as a, if you know what I mean?
Okay, well, I mean, Jesus was born, 30, 40, 50 years before the year 30 in our calendar.
Yeah.
So, had Jesus been born at some other period of time, and because everything would be different if it wasn't in the Jewish context. If Jesus had been born in China, I mean, I don't think we can follow any of those rabbit holes because unless we're starting from a top-down model which says Jesus is the Son of God, he's came to change the world, he picked the most appropriate time to be born. Okay, whereas I'm saying the other end saying, well, here is Jesus, this is where he was born, this is what happened to him, and we want to talk about him as the Son of God. But we're not going to start with a top-down model that says, well, he chose the best-looking girl in the village to be his mum, and he was in control of his own conception. And you start to get into the more you take that top-down approach, you end up with the Jesus who we find in the legends of the New Testament Apocrypha, where when he goes to school on his first day, he already knows all the answers. And the schoolmaster is having a terrible time with this brat in his class. You need to get away? That's when you need to, that's fine. Yeah.
The village at 12.
Well, there you go. All right, we'll move on. So, crucifixion, the fact that Jesus was crucified tells us he was a rebel.
See you later.
He was seen as a rebel. He was seen as a threat to good order. Okay? He wasn't just a religious teacher. He wasn't healing people without a doctor's certificate on his wall. So crucifixion, the fact that Jesus is crucified tells us about the relationship between Jesus and the Roman Empire. Now, we could argue, as a matter of theological principle, that no matter what time Jesus came into human history, he would have run up against the powers that be, and they would have destroyed him by whatever means they had at their disposal. But that's moving from history into speculation. Okay, pushing on. The other thing, of course, is crucifixion was meant to finish him off, get rid of him, no more problems. Solve that one. Case closed. But the earliest followers of Jesus said, actually, no, that didn't work. He's still with us. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things is to be a leader in the early church, you had to be able to say, I met Jesus after Easter. Not, I met Jesus before Easter, which we think was a pretty kosher certificate. But to be an apostle, you had to be somebody who had a direct experience of Jesus on this side of Easter. Otherwise, you couldn't be a leader in the early church, at least for the first decade or so. Okay, you look like you're shaping a question.
No.
Okay. So, and these appearances meant different things. We have stories about Jesus just kind of popping into the room. Hi guys, how you doing? I'm still here. We have stories about an empty tomb, which is kind of like an argument from the negative, isn't it? An empty tomb doesn't actually mean that the person who was in there is alive. It just means that his corpse isn't there now. And remember that crucifixion victims really didn't get buried. Okay? And then you have visions, where people will have a vision of Jesus. So Paul, for instance, riding to Damascus on a campaign to arrest followers of Jesus, and he has this vision, this religious, ecstatic experience that convinces him that Jesus is alive. So he could claim to be an apostle later on. So the crucifixion was meant to get rid of Jesus, and because the resurrection tradition is saying that didn't work, he's still with us. God didn't let death be the final word. And the Easter stories are not actually trying to solve the problem of what happened to Jesus' bones, because nobody in heaven needs bones or muscles. Okay? We're not talking about a physical existence. So the stories of Easter are not about, so what happened to Jesus' body? And there's a perfectly rational but totally horrible human explanation of that, because we know what normally happened to the bodies of crucified people. Okay, now we want to imagine that Mary organised a few of the disciples and they came and rescued the body of Jesus and gave him a proper burial in somebody else's grave that they didn't even own. Okay, but that would imply that Jesus and his family were very well connected with the very authorities who have just murdered him in order to get permission to retrieve his body. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's, pushing the evidence. So that's not what Easter is about. Okay, Easter, and of course Easter is not saying Jesus sort of went, oh, well that was a bit uncomfortable for a couple of days, but I'm glad to be out of that grave. It was very pokey. Now, where's my diary? Where was I meant to be this week? Okay, Easter is not about Jesus coming back to pick up his schedule. Done, gone, finished. He's moved on to something else. Easter is Jesus being vindicated by God and saying, I'm with you. What you're talking about, I'm talking about. That's what Easter is about. And the way I like to talk about it is that Jesus passed through death into God's own life. He didn't come back. He went on, as we all do. Okay. These days, with defibrillators and so on, we can bring people back, but only within very narrow windows of time. Okay. And in fact, 1 Corinthians 15 has this interesting phrase, Jesus, he calls him the last Adam at this point, Jesus became a life-giving spirit, okay, who frankly does not have flesh and bones. Life-giving spirits living in heaven with God, caught up into God's own existence, whatever metaphor you want to use, don't have flesh and blood. All right. So what we sometimes do is try to distinguish talking about Jesus before Easter and talking about Jesus after Easter. Okay. And in other words, we talk about the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And we sort of play with those two words, Jesus, Christ, and say, well, let's use Jesus to think about the person before Easter, and we'll talk about the Christ figure who Jesus became when we're thinking about Jesus after Easter. So the Jesus before Easter, we can do a sort of CV on him. He was a Jewish prophet. He was a teacher of sorts, particularly oral instruction, parables and aphorisms and so on. He was a healer, and he was an activist. He was a campaigner. If he was around today, he'd be on the Sea Shepherd going down to save the whales or whatever. He was a campaigner. He was gathering other people around his vision of the covenant between God and Israel being refreshed and renewed. He wasn't trying to start a new religion. He was trying to reinvigorate Jewish practice in his own time. And his key idea was the kingdom of God, which we use it in English because England had a kingdom in the time of James I, and Spain had an empire. So the good Greek word for empire, it gets translated as kingdom in the King James Bible, because the empire were the enemy of England. Okay, so Jesus is talking about the empire of God as distinct from the empire of Caesar, the activist. And of course, this leads to tension with the Roman imperial powers, and that's only going to end in one way, namely the cross. Unless Jesus chickens out, takes a fast camel out of town, and abandons his mission. Okay, but if he's not going to abandon his mission, you know where it's going to end. And that's what the gospel today was talking about. The Son of Man, that was me, yours truly, has to go to Jerusalem, be beaten up and tortured and handed over and crucified, but I will be back. This will not be the end of me. So Jesus after Easter, we talk about the Christ of faith, and in more recent times we even talk about the cosmic Christ, that we no longer just think about what God is doing in terms of earth and humans, but we've realised we're just a pimple on the pumpkin in terms of the universe. Okay? So when we're talking about God and we're talking about Christ, we've got to talk about the cosmos, not just planet Earth, not just God being for humans. God is for cockroaches, God is for ants, God is for spiders. I mean, all of us are God's creation. Our theology has been so anthropocentric, and it's still so, whatever the word is, earth-centered. Okay? Which is fair enough, it's where we live. I mean, but surely it must be the case that God's agenda is bigger than planet Earth. Okay? Otherwise, why make the rest of the universe? So Jesus' actions and Jesus' teachings are validated by the resurrection, and they expected him to return very, very soon, like within the next couple of years, and establish the empire of God. And they were wrong. He didn't come back. So the church has a solution for that. We redefine the terms and say, well, the church is the kingdom of God. Okay? That's the spin doctors. So when Christians come, the people who are followers of Jesus, and they didn't call themselves Christians at the time, that emerges later, we began to recognise that Jesus was God among us and God for us in a human being, in human form. That Jesus is a kind of an icon, a picture of our own destiny in God's future blessing. What happens to Jesus is what's going to happen to us. And then that develops the idea of the church as a local cell, a local activist cell of the Jesus movement. Okay? So you get this idea of the way, the people of the way. It's a phrase we find used in earliest Christianity. These are people of the way, because Christianity as a name had not yet developed. So Christianity is a way of life. It's not fire insurance against the fires of hell. Okay? Christianity is for here and now in this life. Okay? And we had an easy run through the Middle Ages and early modernity when the death rates were horrific, in plagues, Black Death, whatever. We could sell Christianity as fire insurance for the next life. But, we've really got to look at our product range and say, no. What we're on about is what difference does God make now in our lives? It's not a fan club for Jesus. He's not our bestie. Okay, you don't have to be in love with Jesus, despite some of the songs that are sung in churches around Grafton on a Sunday morning. Okay, not at the cathedral, rarely, hopefully never at the cathedral. But Jesus is not a house elf, to use Harry Potter language, and he's not our best friend. He's a rigorous. Would we want him on parish council? If he was even eligible to be elected. Get the idea?
He might not be needed.
He'd be he'd be a challenging person to have. You may not have him on your list of people I'd love to have as a meal guest sometime. Okay? We've domesticated him. We've made him almost like a pet. Hey, Jesus, come here, sit. Nice Jesus. Okay. But no, that's not what we're talking about here. Okay. It's more than a philosophical belief system where we have all these nicely nuanced and balanced theories about humanity and divinity and sin and purity and all the rest, which ends up saying men are good, girls are bad, is where that goes in the end. Because the girls get all the messy bits, babies, dead bodies, menstruation, whatever, and the boys get all the fun bits, supposedly. We know where that ends up. We've had, thousands of years of practical experience. People of the way are people who join Jesus in bringing God's mission to completion. And that's probably because I wrote this first and then wrote the sermon for this morning. That's really where the sermon from this morning grew out. Come and do what I'm doing. Come and go where I'm going. That's the call of discipleship. And we're always learners. We've always got an L plate. We never get to be masters of Christianity, but we are practitioners of faithful living. Now, I want to now quickly flick across to a 3-minute video clip. This is from the Episcopal Church in the US, as you can see from their little logo. The Episcopal Church is what the Anglican Church is called in America, because after the War of Independence, it wasn't really cool to call it the Church of England. So it was called the Episcopal Church, the church that has bishops, as distinct from the Presbyterians or the Methodists or whatever. So the Episcopal Church is our tribe in America. And they've got, last few years, they've had a new presiding bishop. And we all saw him on the video at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Michael Curry, an African-American. And right from almost day one, he was talking about the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. That was his way of talking about church, the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement, loving, liberating, life-giving. Now, if I can make this work, I've got a couple of quotes from him, that's okay. But I want to actually flick through more quickly to the video because of time. But the Jesus movement is the ongoing community of people who centered their lives on Jesus and following him into loving, liberating, life-giving relationships with God, with each other, and with creation. Now, if we start to take that seriously, that's a whole different way of being church. Okay? And Jesus launched this movement when he welcomed the first disciples to follow his loving, liberating, life-giving way. Come and follow me. Do what I'm doing. Go where I'm come where I'm going. Okay. So the whole of our lives can get caught up into this. Now I think I've got, oh no, there's more. But anyway, you'll see, if you're getting the app, you're going to see this during the week because I've decided to use some of his words in the app, including just some very simple suggestions. When you get up in the morning, say, "Morning, God. Now, how can my actions today promote loving, liberating, life-giving way of Jesus?" Or I'm coming up to a decision point here. God, help me to make the decision which is going to be most loving, most liberating, most life-giving. At the end of the day, before you fall asleep, I love this, with genuine curiosity and zero judgment of yourself, say, when did I see myself or others being loving, liberating or life-giving today? Where do I wish I'd seen that happening but didn't? This is the old tradition of self-examination, but it's being couched in terms of the Jesus movement. Now here's the guy. It's just come up. Yep, here it comes. Thanks to our internet in the world.
We've been talking for a little over a year now about being the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. And somebody recently said to me, I said, Bishop, why don't you paint us a picture? Give us a picture of the Jesus movement so that we can see it. When the gospel is about to be read, the congregation stands up. Something is going on. And then more than that, as the gospel moment is approaching, a deacon, if there is a deacon in the particular church, a person who has been ordained to be at the intersection of the church and the world, is asked to read or chant the gospel. And they come down sometimes with a gospel book held high. And there's music and the congregation is singing as the gospel of Jesus, the teachings, the life and the spirit of Jesus enter, in a sense, the room through the reading of the gospel. And then on top of that, everyone in the room turns and reorients from wherever they are. They turn and reorient themselves facing the place of the gospel and stand for the reading of the gospel, for hearing the teachings of Jesus. That gospel moment, the church has become the Jesus movement, with life reoriented around the teachings of Jesus and around his very spirit. Teachings and a spirit that embody the love of God in our lives and in this world. A way of love that seeks the good and the well-being of the other before the self's own unenlightened interest. A way of love that is not self-centered, but other-directed. A way of love grounded in compassion and goodness and justice and forgiveness. It is that way of love that is the way of Jesus. And that way of love that can set us all free. Someone once said, when you look at Jesus, you see one who is loving, one who is liberating, and one who is life-giving. And that is what the way of Jesus is about. And that is the movement of Jesus. A community of people committed to living the way of Jesus, loving, liberating, and life-giving, and committed to going into the world to help this world become one that is loving, liberating, and life-giving. Jesus once said, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, 42nd Street and 3rd Avenue. You will be my witnesses. Witnesses to a way that is loving, liberating, and life-giving. And that, my friends, can change this world.
Isn't he a stunning bishop and communicator of the gospel? We could use another 25 or so like that in the Australian church for sure. Okay, so to end at that point, and just as the Angelus rings, sort of teasing out that the essence of being a Christian is that we are disciples of Jesus. We'll try and articulate all the theory around that with fancy words, but the essence is we're followers of Jesus. We're disciples of Jesus. We want to be loving. We want to be liberating. We want to be life-giving. We want to make the world like that. Okay, so hopefully that's been a different kind of angle on thinking about being disciples of Jesus.